For years, Iran looked like a permanent fixture of Middle Eastern power, unyielding, ideological, immovable. But now something has cracked. What began as protests over prices and livelihoods has morphed into something far more dangerous for Tehran, an open challenge to the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic itself. Chants are no longer about reform, they are about replacement. And in a region already shaken by wars, realignments, and collapsing old orders, this matters far beyond Iran's borders. Because when a central pillar of the Middle East starts to wobble, the tremors don't stop at the border. Israel watches with cautious hope, Gulf states with nervous restraint, Lebanon with existential fear, Turkey with strategic calculation. Each sees something different in the streets of Iran, but all understand the same truth. This is not just a domestic uprising. If you want to understand where the Middle East is heading next, you have to start here. Stay with me. And to see why these protests matter so much, we first need to define what is really at stake. To understand what is unfolding, we need to be precise about the nature of this moment. These protests are not a single event. They are a convergence of pressures that have been building for years. Economic hardship, a collapsing currency, rising inflation, and a growing belief among ordinary Iranians that their sacrifices are being diverted elsewhere toward foreign conflicts and proxy networks rather than life at home. What makes this moment different is not only the scale of the demonstrations, but their direction. The slogans cut to the core of the system. Protesters are no longer appealing to leaders. They are rejecting the premise of the regime itself. That shift transforms unrest into a systemic threat. The government's response reveals how seriously it takes that threat. A violent crackdown, information blackouts, severed communications, and death tolls that are difficult to verify but undeniably grim. Power is asserting itself through force because persuasion has failed. For the region, this raises a larger question. What happens when a state built on ideology begins to lose the consent of its people? To answer that, we have to step back and look at how Iran arrived at this point in the first place. To see how Iran reached this crossroads, we have to think in terms of cycles: political, economic, and regional. For decades, the Islamic Republic sustained itself through a simple bargain. The state promised resistance, dignity, and regional influence. In return, citizens were asked to endure economic hardship and political restriction. That bargain held as long as ideology could compensate for daily life. But over time, the costs mounted. Sanctions tightened, the currency eroded, inflation hollowed out the middle class, and Iran's regional ambitions, from Lebanon to Gaza to Yemen, became more expensive and more visible. What once felt like strategic depth began to feel like national depletion. Meanwhile, the regional environment shifted. The Islamic State was weakened, old battle lines faded, and Iran's confrontational posture began to look less like leadership and more like isolation. Even longtime adversaries in the Gulf started exploring de-escalation, signaling that the region itself was moving on. This left Tehran trapped in an older logic, investing abroad while legitimacy at home eroded. History tells us that regimes often fall not when they are weakest militarily, but when their governing model no longer matches reality. Iran may now be approaching that moment, and moments like this rarely unfold quietly. The first real rupture came when the protests refused to burn out. Instead of fading after days, they spread, city to city, class to class. What shocked the regime was not just the persistence, but the message. No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life only for Iran. In one sentence, protesters dismantled the ideological foundation of Tehran's regional strategy. This was no longer about economics. It was about ownership of the state. The response was immediate and brutal. Security forces moved in. Internet access disappeared, communication lines went dark, and as information collapsed, violence filled the vacuum. Independent estimates now point to thousands killed or detained. The state chose survival through force. But here's the paradox. Every crackdown confirmed the protesters' argument. Every blackout signaled fear. Every funeral created another reason to return to the streets. For regional actors watching closely, this was the moment when uncertainty became unavoidable. If the regime could no longer manage dissent quietly, then stability itself was in question. And when stability breaks in Iran, the consequences never stay internal. Behind the slogans and the street battles lies a deeper structure, one that explains why this crisis is so hard to resolve. Iran is not just a state, it is a system layered with parallel powers. Elected institutions exist, but real authority flows through unelected networks. The supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard, the security services, and the vast economic empires they control. This architecture was designed for resilience, not responsiveness. When pressure rises, the system does not negotiate. It absorbs, deflects, and represses. The economy is militarized. Dissent is securitized. Foreign conflict becomes a release valve, an external justification for internal control. That is why regional proxies matter so much. Groups like Hezbollah are not only tools of influence abroad, they are proof of relevance at home. They signal strength, defiance, purpose. Losing them would weaken the regime's ideological spine. But this machinery has a flaw. It depends on obedience without prosperity. And once citizens stop believing that sacrifice leads to dignity, the system turns inward, consuming itself to survive. This is the moment Iran may be facing now. And when systems built on force begin to strain, they often trigger a second, more dangerous crisis, one that spills far beyond their borders. The second crisis is unfolding not in the streets, but across the region. As Iran turns inward to contain unrest, its external posture becomes unstable. Allies weaken, proxies hesitate, rivals test boundaries, power vacuums invite pressure. Israel has already acted decisively, degrading Hezbollah's capabilities and striking Iranian-linked assets with precision. For Tehran, this is the worst timing imaginable. A regime fighting for legitimacy at home cannot afford to look weak abroad. But escalation carries enormous risk. The Gulf states watch closely, publicly restrained, privately calculating. A distracted Iran is less threatening, but also less predictable. Retaliation, miscalculation, or proxy adventurism could pull the region back into confrontation just as fragile de-escalation had begun. Turkey sees danger of a different kind. If Iran fractures, instability will not respect borders. Refugees, Kurdish unrest, disrupted trade routes, a regional system already under strain could tip. This is how internal crises metastasize, not through grand decisions, but through cascading reactions. Iran's leadership now faces an impossible choice: project strength abroad while bleeding legitimacy at home, or pull back and risk accelerating decline. And it is ordinary people, far from palaces and war rooms, who will feel the consequences first. And this is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because if you are an ordinary Iranian, this crisis is not about strategy or ideology. It is about survival. Prices that double while wages don't. A currency that collapses while officials speak of resistance. A future that keeps shrinking no matter how hard you work. You watch your country spend resources abroad while your own life grows more precarious. You hear promises of dignity, yet experience only restriction. And eventually, a quiet question turns into a loud one. Why am I sacrificing for a system that gives nothing back? That question is now echoing across Iran. And it doesn't stop there. In Lebanon, families struggling through economic collapse look at Tehran's turmoil and wonder what happens to Hezbollah's lifeline. In Israel, civilians calculate whether instability means safety or sudden war. Across the Gulf, people hope the storm stays contained. If this resonates with you, pause for a moment. Share this. Because understanding power means understanding how it touches real lives. And as these human pressures build, the impact will not remain local. It will reshape the balance of the entire region. As the reverberations of this crisis extend outward, the world is left to wonder, what will become of the Middle East? The answer hinges on three distinct futures, three possible scenarios that could unfold depending on how the Iranian regime responds to this internal revolt. In the best-case scenario, Iran's leadership recalibrates. The regime, weakened but not shattered, finds a way to restore some level of stability through meaningful reforms or a transition of power. A more pragmatic leadership emerges, one willing to heal relations both at home and abroad. In this future, Iran takes steps toward peaceful coexistence, reducing tensions with Israel, the Gulf, and Lebanon, and opening the door to a new era of cooperation. The middle road sees a prolonged struggle, one that drags on without clear resolution. The regime may survive, but it does so under immense pressure. Protest movements continue to simmer, and internal repression keeps the country at odds with itself. Regional dynamics remain volatile, but conflict is less about military confrontation and more about strategic containment. Tensions persist, and while open war may be avoided, the region continues to deal with the consequences of a fractured, uncertain Iran. In the worst-case scenario, Iran's regime collapses. Chaos follows, with power struggles erupting both within the country and across the region. Iran's proxies and allies scramble for power, while rivals see an opportunity to reshape the balance of influence. The Gulf states, Israel, and even Turkey could become directly involved as regional rivalries intensify, potentially leading to full-scale conflict. The future of the Middle East rests on a knife's edge, with these scenarios hanging in the balance. But one thing is clear, the events in Iran are far from a domestic issue. They are a tectonic shift with ripple effects that will reshape the entire region for years to come. And as we turn the page on this moment, the question remains, how will the region adapt? What will the world do next? As we come to the close of this analysis, we are left with more than just questions. We are left with insights. The protests in Iran are more than just a domestic upheaval. They are the manifestation of a deep systemic crisis, one that will shape the future of the Middle East. Whether they lead to regime change or the continuation of the status quo, the consequences will be felt across the region for years to come. For Israel, the Gulf states, Lebanon, and Turkey, the stakes are clear. A weaker, unstable Iran could mean new opportunities, but also greater risks. The balance of power in the Middle East is fragile, and as Iran's internal crisis deepens, the region braces for what comes next. But in the midst of uncertainty, there is one certainty. The future of the Middle East will not look the same as it did just a few years ago. What happens next is up to the people of Iran and to the international community that watches closely. The choices made in the coming months will decide whether this crisis ignites a new chapter of peace and stability or plunges the region into even deeper turmoil. Stay tuned. This story is still unfolding. The question remains, what role will you play in shaping it? As we come to the end of this analysis, it's clear that the events unfolding in Iran are not just reshaping the country itself. They are rewriting the entire Middle Eastern playbook. Whether this leads to a new era of peace and cooperation or drags the region deeper into chaos, it's clear that the outcome will depend on how the situation evolves in the coming months. For the people of Iran, for Israel, the Gulf states, Lebanon, and Turkey, this crisis will be the defining challenge of this decade. How the world responds will shape not just the future of Iran, but the stability of the Middle East and its relationships with the global powers. One thing is undeniable: the Middle East will never be the same again. And the real question is, what will you do as an individual and as part of a global community to shape the future that is coming? The world is watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, share your thoughts. This moment is too important to ignore. The future is not just written by leaders, it's shaped by those who understand the stakes and choose to act. Thank you for joining this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in Middle Eastern history. The story is unfolding, and we all have a role in how it plays out.